right, I'm going to get started here. Welcome everyone as you continue to come in. Welcome to our event today, IIT Institute of Design, and we're talking today about how design can address climate change. So Earth Day is tomorrow. We're, amidst Earth Week. We think this is a really important question, specifically suited for the Institute of Design to answer and discuss. So first I'm going to tell you a little bit about the Institute of Design. And IIT Institute of Design, we refer to ourselves as ID. Here we build responsible, cooperative, intelligent futures. Founded by Laszlo Moholy-Nagy as the new Bauhaus in 1937, we're known for pioneering human-centered design and systems design. We're the only design school in the US devoted completely to graduate students, but we are more than a graduate school. We're an international community of learners and practitioners who embrace complexity and drive impactful change by eliciting a power unique to humans, creativity. And as of this week, we are the new European Bauhaus's only North American partner. So that's of special relevance to today's discussion because Europe aims to be the first climate neutral continent by 2050. You can find out more about this partnership on our website, but today we're going to talk about design's role in addressing climate change, like I mentioned. So we're going to start with a conversation with the panelists that you see here, and then we'll leave some time for Q&A. If you have a question that you'd like to share, you can put it in the Q&A section. Prefer you put it there than in the chat because it's easier for us to manage. And we've also had some great questions already submitted through Eventbrite, so we'll be able to address a few of those as well. Without further ado, I'm going to introduce our moderator today, who is Rosanna Lederhosen. She is going to introduce the rest of our panelists. Rosanna is Master of Design and MBA candidate at the Institute of Design with a background in brand strategy and sustainable packaging. Rosanna, I'll leave it to you.
Hello, hi. I'm Rosanna, as we mentioned. I wanted to introduce the panelists first. We have my classmate, Anand. He has a Master's of Design candidate at ID with a background in mechanical engineering. And since joining ID, starting with the foundation program, he has tried to implement sustainable and equitable practices within his own process. He's actually graduating soon, so we will be sad to see him go. We, of course, have Weslynne Ashton, who is a faculty at ID and the Stewart School of Business, which is fantastic that I get to enjoy both. She is a sustainable systems scientist whose research, teaching, and practice are oriented around transitioning our socio-ecological systems towards sustainability and equity, leveraging theories and methods from engineering, design, and management. She studies the adoption of socially and environmentally responsible strategies in business, and the role of innovation and entrepreneurship in addressing social and environmental challenges. And last but not least, we have Brandon, who is an amazing alum of ID, who is always around and very helpful. Brandon leads a program on US climate change for the leading nonprofit in behavior change for conservation called RARE. Named Make It Personal, the program engages Americans in the 7 behaviors that have the biggest impact on carbon emissions. And he wanted to add that he has a love of spreadsheets, which is an unnatural trait for designers, which is fantastic. To kick off this conversation, I think a great place to start, as Kristen had mentioned, the theme of today is how designers have a role in impacting climate change. So I wanted to begin with asking Weslynne a little bit about your background and how you found design to play a role within your systems thinking.
Thanks, Rosanna. So it's really interesting that I've ended up in design school because my primary training is as an environmental engineer. And I like to tell folks that the traditional environmental engineering pedagogy is all about how do we clean up waste, right? So our factories have produced goods and services, and so we have a lot of contaminants that have resulted because, back in the 60s and 70s, kind of even up through the present, many firms just weren't responsible for the externalities that they created with regards to their environmental emissions and pollutants. And in my last semester of undergraduate, I took a course where I was introduced to the concept of industrial ecology. And this was like such a game changer for me because it introduced the idea that rather than cleaning up waste after it's already there, how can we design our industrial systems in a way that they can eliminate waste in the first place? And so I went to graduate school in environmental science and did work that was really very interdisciplinary. So at the intersection of environmental engineering and management and also sociology. And so I feel like I've been doing design adjacent work for a number of years. And I have been at IIT for about 10 years now in the Stewards School. And it's only in the last kind of 3-4 years when ID joined the downtown campus temporarily that I had more opportunity to interact with designers. And that really opened my eyes to design, and that the work that I was doing was really very closely related to design, and provided some of the language and tools for enabling that work around sustainable design. And so I've been moved into a joint appointment with ID only in the last, last August, so less than a year. And when we were thinking about what are the things that I would teach at ID, we thought about systems thinking, which is something that has been in the ID curriculum for a number of years. And with my transition in, that's something that I've taken over and have been able to bring in how we think not only about Western systems, but indigenous framings around systems thinking. And then I've also been teaching a new course in climate change and kind of how design can have a role in climate change. So let me stop there. I feel like I've been talking a lot.
I think that's a great segue to maybe jumping to Anand about the course. We were both in your course on climate change this fall. And I was wondering your perspective, how did it shift maybe entering the course and leaving, and just some thoughts on how you as a designer have changed.
Yeah, first of all, I'd like to thank Weslynne for offering such a great course. And I think it was really eye-opening into what the actual science goes behind climate change. And this was the first time that I took a class like this. Um, the readings around the class with especially the All We Can Save, which is an outstanding book with like feminine perspectives around climate activism, and it shows the different sectors of work, whether it be law, policy, or um, the governments, and how the women from different sectors have had experiences dealing with climate change. And yeah, and in the end of the class, we kind of discussed or made climate negotiations with our classmates, where we had to make those real life decisions through a simulation as working through a large corporation, and we were able to see like the larger picture, the kind of barriers that are resisting the change, and what kind of levers would you want to pull on to have like the biggest impact. um, but one of the better things that I learned from the class was the ability to communicate around climate change, the ability to talk about it, to share with my peers my thoughts, and having that power to just have that conversation with your fellow designers. I think that gave me a great leverage over that. Yeah.
I really liked what you said about levers. I think what was interesting with the course was that when working on a systems level, there are so many levers that you're not even thinking about are at play. And we have this perspective of like sustainability and this co-opted word that we hear all the time. And I think it's really interesting how just different stakeholders come to play, and different levers, like you said, are being pulled. And that kind of brings me to Brandon. Hi. I kind of wanted to ask this question towards you. Since we're all here to kind of understand what levers we can push and kind of our role in this movement, I was wondering if you could speak to what drove you to your current role and how do you advise designers to address climate change, maybe even if they're not working at such a great place like you are that's so focused on it?
Yeah. So, and I think along the way, if I don't hit it, then one of us should, and stop and kind of explain what we might mean by systems and a systems view. But to answer your question, I arrived at my current role from a pathway of leading a design organization, design consultancy, to leading big swaths of the customer facing experience for Capital One. But really, as I looked into the future and maybe thought a little bit as a futurist would, just saw that there was a big difference between the most probable future we're heading towards with climate change and the preferable future that we could have. And feeling like there's really a missing role for design there, but also struggling to find, okay, where's a place where that can happen? And actually spent a good bit of time just figuring out whether I was going to have to start something up myself because no one was doing it. But yet I felt the pressure and the calling to do it. Or whether I could really find somewhere. And that's where I was excited to run across RARE, the organization I'm presently at, because they asked the question, well, RARE is the leader in conservation and behavior change. So how do we apply the science of behavior change to conservation? And they asked the question, okay, well, what about individuals and what can they do about climate change? Because there's a lot around policy, there's a lot around what corporations need to do. What is it that individuals could do? And as you mentioned in the intro, they found the 7 behaviors that individuals could take on that has the highest impact in the US to reduce their emissions. What was unique about that, though, is it's a consumer problem. It's the tool set that designers are most often equipped with, and I feel very comfortable with is, oh, okay, well, I've been working to engage people to, enlist in a new, the experience of buying a new home or signing up for a new web-based service or getting a credit card, whatever it might be. But just as simply, we can design how they take on new behaviors like eating less meat or making their next car purchase, if they're a car owner, making that next purchase an electric vehicle. Largely the same tool set, it's just now applied from a different lens. And I think many designers can work in many number of ways. You don't have to jump fully into it. I think it begins with looking at your own work and starting to know and ask the question of what really matters. What in my work actually ends up creating carbon? What in my work could actually reduce carbon? A lot of designers create customer journeys and blueprints and interaction flows and things like that. And you got to ask yourself, where along that path might that be created? Or even just what questions can I bring up? Even, where's our offsite going to be in a few months from now? And what are we doing to reduce carbon there? Because I find that as people start to become aware of where carbon is created, of what causes climate change, that can become a part of the dialogue that it isn't today. And I think that's one of the big powerful things you can do in any job is find out if your organization has an ESG report that says how they're doing on environment, sustainability, and governance. Know what levers are there in your organization and see how your current role can line up with that.
A lot to take in. Anand and I spoke and we wrote a really fun article on Medium for ID recently, and we spoke to that about like your mindset and going into any job that you have, especially since we're at the beginning of our design process and our design journey, kind of thinking about where, like you said, where you yourself might have an impact, whether you work in waste management or maybe you work at a job where you're manufacturing something. You're always having an interesting role. And I guess, Weslynne, maybe we can jump to you. If Brandon was speaking on an individual level, can you speak to work on a larger level or a systems level and how that impacts us?
Right. So Brandon, throughout the question, how are we defining systems? And I think about systems as, any group of activities, individuals, organizations that are working together consciously or unconsciously to deliver some function or goal or purpose. So when we think about, our economic system, there's no overall goal, right? We're all individual actors, individual organizations that are interacting, but are achieving an overall purpose of hopefully, helping people to lead better lives, to improve the material quality of our lives, as well as
What a very modern Zoom moment. Give her a couple of moments.
And how the work that they do and how their value chains contribute to climate change. And so, one of the things that we look at, and that I've brought in from the industrial ecology field into design, is thinking about the life cycle impacts of any product that you design, right? So if you're a product designer, we think about, okay, what are the materials? How are we going to put them together? But can we also think about where those materials are coming from? What communities? What are the sources? What are the environmental impacts with where those materials are coming from? How they're being produced and transported to customers? What do customers do with it to use them? And then what happens at the end of life? So after customers are finished using it, is it going into a landfill, or can it be recycled, repurposed in some way? And so I think that, as designers, I think there's an onus on thinking about the bigger picture about how what you're designing fits into the kind of global ecological system, right? So are there ways to redesign products so that they might have a positive environmental impact, right? And not a net negative one, right? So we can talk about, carbon neutral, net negative. So how can we kind of redesign our products so that we're actually reducing climate change and reducing the impacts of those products?
And a lot of people have asked in the chat and with the Eventbrite submissions that I was reading through, speaking of stakeholders and kind of the work, if you are trying to design something that's better, is there a way to convince stakeholders or move towards a better path with people who might not want to do it? Is that part of systems change? Is that part of our role as designers as well in this movement?
I'll take a swing at that, which is, I think this is a classic problem of design. If you think about some of the core tenets of design, like we talk about desirable, feasible, and viable as parts of a great solution. And designers have always been good at bringing the parts the business needs to understand back, from outside of the walls of the organization back within it, of like, okay, but this is how human beings are actually experiencing your product or service. Okay, here's what their needs actually are. And let's tell it in a compelling way. And let's give you a vision of how you could do that better, that people can start to touch and rally around and think about how they could do that better. The same set of tools can be used inside of an organization to think about, okay, but what are the impacts to the larger system that the larger system is creating, that this product or service is about, or this brand is about? How can we help people really feel the negative consequences of what we might be creating here? How can we make that visceral to them? How can we make a powerful vision of how we could do it differently? How can we have the right conversations to understand as a business, why would we be doing better if we did it the right way? So I think it's in our toolkit. It's just using it from a slightly different frame of, instead of empathy, maybe for the customer today, it's empathy for the kids who are going to have to live in the world that we create tomorrow. And how do you bring that to the discussion of what businesses are doing? What stakeholders need to make decisions about?
I think that there's also a misperception about how many people are those climate deniers. If one of the things that we've looked at is the Yale program on climate communication, and their regular surveys of perceptions around climate change of the American public. And they've found that, it's probably less than 30% of Americans would be in that category of active deniers. And so we have way more people who are aware that climate change is going on, who are concerned about it, who may or may not kind of see it present in their lives, but are looking for information about what are the best ways that they might change their actions. And I think, this ties well with the work that Brandon is doing at Rare, understanding what are those behaviors that will have a significant impact on climate, and kind of reducing their individual impact, and how that contributes to reducing larger systems impacts. And so I think that, there are many more willing people who are looking for information that we can target. And I think, part of that targeting is with behaviors, but it's also with stories, and kind of changing the narrative about what's involved in climate change, right? So it's looking at the individual things, but then also looking at larger systems, right? So particular organizations, how particular industries might be targeted to reduce emissions.
I think that's an awesome point. I think the research kind of bears out that, especially in the US, like you said, there's not that many more climate deniers. The massive part of the US believes climate change is real, and they're alarmed or concerned about it. The big gap is people don't know it matters. And I think that's true of individuals and consumers. I think that's also true within businesses, of like, we can easily end up becoming obsessed and trying to correct something that doesn't have that big of an impact. Like in my work, we know when we ask Americans what's the biggest impact action they can take on climate change, they say recycle. Unfortunately, we know that that's not even a top 25 answer in terms of actions that have the most impact. We should all recycle, that's great. But also, if you think it's going to be the thing that's really addressing climate change, there are much higher impact things you can do. And that's true when you think about what does a business need to do. And so I kind of curious from the class perspective. I happened to sit in when Weslynne asked y'all to calculate your own footprints. I'm curious from y'all's perspective, like, what was that experience like to actually step in and see, what actually were big impacts for you, and what did that bring to the dimension of the class? That reveal, was it different what you expected? What was that like?
Yeah, that I can jump in here. I like to think of myself as a active environmentalist in the space or whatnot. I've been very fortunate to have access to lots of great readings and lots of lifestyle changes, and yet my climate impact is much higher than I'd like it to be. I think the doing this survey actually made me realize how part of the system I am. I can do all these things, and I can compost, and I can walk, I can do my small part, but in reality, I hope I get this fact right, but I want to say that Illinois, especially, I think it's like around 50% of our energy comes from coal, whereas the national average is maybe closer to 30%. So even if I have an electric car, or do all these things, I'm still using coal at a pretty high rate. So it was interesting to see how much that I'm really part of the system rather than really working on my own.
And you, Anand?
Yeah, that's what I was thinking when I was taking the class with Weslynne, was even before I am a designer, I am a human. And we're all humans here. So it's the steps, it's the kind of things that we do, the behaviors that we have every day that we need to kind of change before we get to the whole systems level change. And I think bringing that small change in your behavior as a human being, understanding your impacts over the way you're living your life and its impact over the environment is, I think, crucial for us as designers to understand, because we we study about behaviors, user behaviors every day, and I think it's up to us to really look inside our own behaviors and bring about that change into ourselves before we can advocate for that. And I think that is what I have found really hard.
I wanted to bring up something that, Weslynne, you mentioned earlier about how we had defined systems thinking. Would it be possible for you to define kind of how you see circularity? I know that word comes up a lot as well and is becoming very popular, circular design. I was wondering if you could speak to that and our role as designers.
Sure. So the notion of circularity and the circular economy is that we can more effectively utilize the resources that we are extracting from the earth, and separating what we might call biological materials from technical materials, and keeping those separate so that we can put them back into circulation more effectively. Now, there are some thermodynamic limits on how much we might be able to reuse and recycle materials. But the overall framing is that, we currently operate in this very linear mode, that we extract resources, put them into products, and then discard them as waste. And so if we are able to cycle those resources, then it becomes much more effective. And this is if, we take primarily a materials perspective. We might also think about the other types of resources that we currently waste in society, right? So our buildings, our old factories, our people, all right, that we are not investing in particular communities as much as others. And so if, we want to have a more sustainable, and I know you and Anand, in the Medium article talked about, the squishiness and ambiguity of sustainability. But that, I think that's still how I frame my work. And I see circularity as an offshoot of sustainability. So circularity can contribute to sustainability, where we're really looking at how do we manage our economy, our earth systems, so that humans and other species can thrive in the long term, right? So kind of harking back to Brandon's point, not only designing for users today, but for the children and grandchildren of those users, so that the resources that we rely on today can be available in the future.
Brandon, do you have something to add? Go ahead.
I was just going to say, I see some comments in the chat coming up. I think probably some public of like, hey, what's the role though of activism? What's the role of voting? What are those highest impact? What should we say there? I think we're in a state where we need to move forward on all fronts. And so I think policy is truly important. I think let's acknowledge, for example, I think tomorrow it's been linked that Biden will say we need to cut our emissions in half over the next decade in the US. UK is coming out with a similar bold objective, a bold goal. So great that we're realizing our goals need to be even more aggressive. We still need to figure out how we're getting there, right? And that's going to require change in government, change in organizations, change in the systems that those create, and change at the consumer end as well. For example, one of the behaviors we try to focus on is eat less meat. Well, salad has existed for a long time, right? There needs to be no technology innovation there. And so how do we help so that as solutions arrive because of better policy, because of better technology, because of better products and services from organizations, how do we ensure consumers are also ready to create this new norm, that we are moving from the lifestyle we have today as human beings to the lifestyle we're going to be required to have in a decade? And so I think we do need to make that change. And I think you also have to ask what changes people's minds about how they vote, about what things they support. And I don't think it's just through being provided with information. Designers can have a role in that. Designers can have a role in more evocative communication, better visceral presentation of what the future could be versus in good and bad scenarios. But I also find that people act their way into new beliefs. And so you're not going to be very likely to support a maybe carbon tax if you haven't ever bought a carbon offset before. Or you're not likely to support, let's say, better streets for bicycling if you don't ride a bike to work. But if you start seeing yourself as a cyclist, you start seeing yourself as someone who supports that kind of policy, or if you start seeing yourself as someone who tries to eat less meat, you might support subsidies for farmers who are raising, vegetables rather than cattle. And so through changing your behaviors is a great way, and changing what you believe about those around you and what they do. If you see other people taking positive behaviors, you're going to assume as a society, we believe in that thing. And I will vote for people who are furthering that idea. And so I think it takes a lot of approaches. Yes, vote today, but also change your behavior so those around you know that these things are important to you too. And it will internalize in them and change the policies they support. It will change the decisions they try to make it work to support this new kind of system we have to build for the future.
I'll just add that I think, like that normalization of behaviors is important, right? Like people respond to peer pressure, and seeing that others are engaged in particular behaviors, that they're acting a certain way, that they have solar panels on their house, normalize it and makes it easier for others to adopt those behaviors as well. I saw a question in the chat about, tackling the big elephant in the room, which is profit maximization and capitalism, and actually just getting out of class where we were talking about how companies or some companies are evolving in the way that they're thinking about the value that they create. So whether you're a social enterprise or cooperative enterprise, but really looking beyond profit maximization as the goal, and thinking about the other types of value that one can create through business. And that's environmental value. And I saw, one of the comments about regenerative design, right? So not only thinking circular, how can we, effectively utilize those resources, but regenerative. So how can what we design actually contribute positively to restoring ecosystems. So I think that recognizing that there is a shift. I think we're in a long moment of shifting towards different types of value being recognized as legitimate as profit maximization for business. And I think that's really exciting and opens up a lot of roles for designers to bring in narratives, stories, tools that can demonstrate how those alternative values can benefit a company or an organization.
There are some amazing questions in the chat. It's almost hard to keep up with how many people have posted some really thought-provoking questions. I think one thing that I know a few people are interested in who are new to the topic, just new to design or new to sustainability, is kind of how do we stay focused on the topic, and how does one as a new person in the space, how do you decide what levers are important to grab onto?
Sure. I think staying steeped in the space will get easier and easier because there are much better resources and it's becoming a constant point of communication. So pick sites like GRIST that write on it constantly, activist sites as well, but there's lots of journalism around it. Bloomberg, New York Times, others, Atlantic, all have sections of and columns dedicated to this. I think from a design perspective, there are groups like climatedesigners.org and numerous Slack groups. They're just constantly working on what is the overlap between design and climate. So that's another way to stay steeped in it. But then I think with your job, with what you're doing actively, it's also starting to become really familiar with those things like the ESG reports, or what are common guidelines for your industry that are becoming published, becoming more common. I think what we're seeing overall as a trend is huge amounts of inflow of money into ESG funds. So individuals and other groups who are saying, no, we want our money invested in businesses that have a certain stance. And there's all different measures of it, but different stances on ESG. And those organizations who are handling those investments are getting better and better at defining what they expect to see from organizations. And so these metrics of what matters is going to become industry by industry, company by company, is going to become much more evident over time. You just have to keep on looking for it and then connect your work back to what are the aspects that have the highest impact. So that'd be a very top-down approach. Bottom up is look at the thing you're working on right now and ask yourself, where is carbon being created? Where is it not circular? What is wrong with this system?
Thank you. I was going to jump to something that you said, but you might have already covered it. However, someone had asked in the chat, if you were to choose a job, do you then, like you just mentioned, top down versus bottom up, do you recommend going into a job where you have all access to these environmental changes and you can push on these levers, or is it better to go into a space where it's just completely crazy and you're kind of the voice of reason? This might just be an opinion, but I'd be curious as to our role as designers, where we can have the most impact.
Go ahead, Wesley.
I was going to say, it probably depends a lot on your personality and how much resist going against the grain. I think it's certainly easier to work in an organization that's aligned with your values. And I think that we are seeing more organizations espouse those values, in part because the current generation, millennials, are demanding it, right? So having grown up with stronger eco-consciousness, that there's an expectation amongst millennials that they want to work in organizations that align with their values. And so just from a recruiting talent perspective, that's one of the reasons why I think some corporations are responding to that and thinking about how their values align with those of the younger generation. I mean, I think it's certainly important to work in spaces where that's not conventional, but recognizing that that's going to be a lot more work, right? And to push against the grain, and it's probably has a lot to do with your personality and how much you fight for those things. But certainly there are many opportunities there.
Yeah, I'm curious from a student perspective, as you have looked at internships or future jobs and career paths, like what role has it played in your decision process? Like, is it a filter that you've used? Is it part of your criteria? Is it something you even, let's say, advertise or promote yourself? Like, is it a line item in your resume of things you know how to do?
Yeah, I think when I'm looking for certain companies, there's definitely that criteria where they are open about their sustainable initiatives. They are very advocative about it in their, even if it's just a simple job posting where they would, I mean, it's great for me to look at companies in their job postings promoting and advocating that initiative in the company for sustainability. But I think another thing is, I think while looking for jobs is, would you want to work for a company that makes you lie about what they're doing? Would you want to, just go through your work every day and just show on the outside that you're doing completely something different, uh, rather than what you're actually doing? I think would be a good lens to look at a company.
Definitely. I see something similar. I see my role as a designer as gaining these toolkit of parts and this methodology to help problem solve this big climate disaster that we're in. So I actually struggle with this question all the time, Brandon. Thank you for bringing it up. I don't know what I want, but I do know that I have this toolkit, and like you said, focusing on empathy and focusing on what we can do as equitable designers and sustainable designers. And then how do I apply that into whatever role that I'm in, whether it's working at a bad company or working at a better company, but hopefully making some changes that are actually good for this planet would be ideal. And not lying, like you said, Anand, that would be hard to work at a company that doesn't align with my values.
Yeah, and I think that's important to realize for employers, is that the next wave of talent, they're not going to be able to get unless they're showing that they are, or they're on a trajectory to address some of these issues, whether it's social or whether it's sustainability related. And so I think that's going to be a part of talent strategy and talent acquisition, is actually being able to act and help people act on sustainability.
Hi all, I'm back here because we're getting to 12:45 and we want to make sure to make some room here for some questions, because we have so many great ones, and we actually entered this conversation with a lot of great questions too, so we're not going to be able to get to everything, but I try to cluster and hit some of the points that we keep seeing again and again. But before I do that, I just wanted to just quickly ask you, Anand and Rosanna, I think earlier in the conversation, maybe it was Weslynne asked you, or someone asked about how you computed your footprints in class. There's a question here about understanding that. Is there like a calculator or a tool for that available? What, can you just share that in the chat perhaps, or tell us about it?
Yeah, it seems like Anand's actually looking for it right now on his computer. I can see. Yeah, it's just a simple kind of input tool. They ask you lots of questions. You kind of see what your household energy use is, what, how many people you live with, those basic questions, and it spits out a number magically. I'm sure there are more, it seems quite accurate, but there are probably more accurate numbers, but it's just averages. So it just depends on where you live. I'm sure Weslynne can speak more to exactly the math there, but it does do some great calculations just to understand your holistic perspective. I doubt that it's like very granular to your specific experience or lived experience, but it was really, really insightful. Yes, he added the link right now in the chat. I highly recommend everyone look into it because you can see what personal levers you can take and decisions you can make on a day-to-day or month-to-month basis that might actually have an impact.
And then there's also been a lot of questions about incentivizing the right behaviors to make progress on this challenge. So I know part of the answer there is probably like, well, how do you incentivize the right behavior? Well, it depends what the behavior is that you're trying to incentivize, but are there any more general sort of answers that you can make or suggestions in terms of maybe things that work versus don't work in terms of incentivizing behavior towards the climate challenge?
I think we found some things that don't work. Often a negative frame isn't the right one, like feeling guilty about your footprint. That does motivate some people, but it isn't long lasting in terms of helping people stick to it. There also things that don't work are 100 tips to improve your carbon emissions. We know from general consumer realities of like, if you give someone 100 choices on the shelf, they're just going to walk away, right? It's just too much to deal with. And so what does help, well, incentives, you immediately come to mind, like tax rebates and other policy related things. And that is one lever, but there are numerous other levers and ones that designers often have a bigger influence on than the others. One is emotional appeal. How do we make it highly emotional, evocative to do this new behavior or try something out that's different, switch to a different habit? Another one is choice architecture. So I was giving you the negative example of 50 tips earlier. How do we go like, this is the one solution for you, right? How do we guide people to the thing that could be the most high impact for them in a really good solution that feels really turnkey and easy to adopt, just like we would for other consumer solutions. And the last one I would say is kind of social levers and social rewards. Is how do you recognize that there is a greater social standing and that amongst your peers, amongst the people you care about, if you adopted this new change, because that actually sometimes short circuits all the other logic of why you would do something, because it has lower emissions, because it saves money, because it's the thing your friends are doing, that drives a lot of incentive.
I'd like to just add to this, to come in at, not just looking at the individuals, but what are policies and strategies that are more effective for businesses or organizations. So a couple of things I'd like to point out. So Brandon mentioned sort of socially responsible investing and ESG. Metrics becoming much more important in kind of how companies talk about themselves, right? So if you've gone to business school, you've seen an income statement and a bottom line. So we all know what a financial bottom line is, right? There are trends to move towards more integrated reporting. So reporting not only what your financial performance is to your shareholders, but your social performance and your environmental performance. So these ESG reporting as a way of increasing transparency and talking about what companies are doing becomes a signal about what's worthy of investment. And so we're seeing that companies that have better ESG performance are seen as better investments. And so their cost of capital is being lowered. And so they are more attractive investments. And so for a company, right, if you want to be to get better access to capital, to get greater investments, then having good ESG performance is really important. So I'd say, kind of transparency, reporting, signal to the market. On the policy side, I think that we do need regulations, and there's a comment in the chat about, like, do we need a national recycling policy? Maybe. I mean, so many things are done on the state level here in the US, but we do have a growing number of states that are implementing what are known as extended producer responsibility laws and policies, which try to put the onus on companies for what happens to their products at end of life, right? So it's not just going into the recycling, maybe it gets recycled or not, but companies are actually responsible for paying for what happens to those products, whether it's taking it back themselves to reprocess those materials or paying for the recycling of it in the general waste stream. And so I think, we might also think about a carbon tax, right? And using that as a way for companies to see the cost of those externalities that they're putting on society and to internalize those costs in what they're doing. So I'd say, like, we have policy levels, we have market levels that we might introduce to help companies internalize and report on those things that can lead to their shifting of behavior.
I think there's a lot of conversation here in the chat about, and in the Q&A, in fact, about sort of the using policy levers versus using, like how you would work in the private sector in terms of financial and growth measurements in order to incentivize the right behavior, work toward progress in this area. And so I just wonder, maybe Brandon, you have some thoughts or perspectives here, having worked in different types of organizations and that may or may not have been interested in this topic of how you might, how do I put this? Whether it's right, when it's right to pull the policy lever, for instance, and when it's right to try to incentivize through other means.
Yeah, my general rule is use 2 levers or more. So I'll pull up and share a quick model of what these different levers are. But you usually find, like, okay, just using the information and education lever may not be enough. We got to figure out something else, another lever that we will pull to actually get the adoption rates where we need them. And so just relying on one is not often going to get you there. I think what you have to do is find solutions that feel highly relevant to the audience you're trying to address. What's the message that's highly relevant and salient to them? Then how do you remove the obstacles, both emotional and logistical, from people to change their habits and ways? And how do you create that social dynamic as well that can really be a flywheel effect for adopting more and more people, a group of people, to adopt new solutions, new ways of living?
And, as someone also puts here in the Q&A, consumerism is part of the problem here. And so I think the other, part of this question is then how do we kind of reverse or have a new paradigm for how what we're even doing in our organizations and what we're after, right? And people do still at this point have to answer to shareholders and that sort of thing. And I don't see that going away entirely. So thoughts there of how to influence change given the constructs that we live in. Weslynne, maybe you want to take this one?
Kristen, I think I was paying attention to the chat and
Oh, no.
I didn't hear you, sorry.
No worries, no worries. Just thinking about how consumerism influences or kind of has probably, in many ways put us in the situation we're in right now to begin with, and what we can do maybe from a systems perspective of either changing that paradigm or influencing organizations, some of which have already kind of changed some of their practices. I think someone mentioned earlier that this is shown to actually be effective in terms of their financial performance. But maybe you can touch on a little bit more about that the system that we're working in and how when to work within the system and when to try to change the system and that sort of thing.
Yeah. So I think similarly, it's one of my earlier comments about it being easier to work within an organization that is already aligned with your values. That I think there are emerging models from societies across the world, including here in the US, that are demonstrating that there's a different way to live and be in an economy. And I'm really inspired by kind of a lot of the work that's happened in this last year since we've been under COVID lockdown, right? And we now have all of these mutual aid groups that have been around, right, for decades, for millennia, right? This is how we worked kind of pre-capitalism, where we bartered and exchanged and shared resources that we had. But mutual aid groups around the country, and I think around the world, are figuring out, are showing how it's possible for people to share resources, how to help each other outside of the capitalist system, and kind of not wanting to monetize that. And so I think that we do have these examples that we can learn from, where people are already doing things in a different way. There are examples from larger companies, right? So Patagonia with don't buy the shirt or don't buy the sweater. I think there is a shift that's happening, but it's right now in niches. And so we need to connect these niches to learn from each other and build momentum so that we can have the systems change. And so I do see that there are openings to move away from the largely consumerist approach that we've had. And I think there's also an onus on designers, right, to think about how what they're designing meets the needs of users, of customers. That isn't necessarily about selling more stuff, right? And so there's, I think, a real need to step back and reconceptualize the value that that we as designers are creating for the people that we're working with.
Does anyone else want to add to that? Otherwise, we're at 1 o'clock. So we have so many more great questions that I'm sorry we're not going to be able to answer them all today, but I'm so glad that everyone came and joined us here. Maybe we could just close quickly with, one idea, one thing that you can do, whether it's even just reading something that you thought was, particularly thought-provoking and helpful, or an action you can take. Maybe each person could just add that here at the end. Who would like to go first? Who's ready?
I can go.
Great.
Oh, Brandon, you want to go? Yeah, so I think this is something that we mentioned in our article as well, where me and Rosanna talked about simple change in material that you use for prototyping, shifting from foam core to chipboard, which is, I mean, obviously not very sustainable, but much more sustainable than what foam core is. So bringing those small changes in your design practice can also help you contribute to in small ways. Yeah.
I was going to take the easy stab, read All We Can Save, and listen to Dr. Ayanna Elizabeth Johnson's podcast, How to Save a Planet. There's lots of great steps and tips and tricks and angles, like Brandon was saying, of different approaches to take with this movement.
You all showed up here today because this obviously matters to you. And it weighs on you, and it's something you want to do something about. It's something you give a damn about, and we need that. I would say, yes, vote. Unfortunately, that only happens every so often. So also pledge to say, hey, what is it in my design work this week, next week, I could actually do just to start the conversation with those around me about how our work right now could affect, because it creates some carbon. It's a way we're doing it that's not as sustainable, because having that conversation is what starts the change. Having people see and realize what's important is what starts the change. And I ask you all to be the leaders.
And I'd add that talking about it and normalizing the conversation that climate change is real. There is scientific consensus that it's real and it's happening, and that we do have a role, and there's something that we can do to contribute to reducing its impacts and adapting to it. So, having this conversation, making this conversation more normal, and as Brandon said, like thinking about, okay, what is something specific that I can do to help identify, where those impacts are and what changes can be implemented.
Great. Thank you all so much for participating today. Thank you, attendees, for joining us. There's some great links that we've got in the chat here, all of which we'll work to compile and send back out to you in an email message, along with the recording of this conversation that'll go on our YouTube channel. So until next time, we do have a couple of events coming up next week, which we hope you'll join. But until next time, we'll see you later. All right. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you all.